welcome to the Past, Present, and Occult podcast with me, Emiliano Noriega Petty. There is going to be a slight change to today's episode. I know that last week I said I was going to be covering magical orders. I'm actually going to be doing that topic as a YouTube video because I need a lot of visuals to make it happen. So instead on here, I'm going to do my episode on the Regis Poem. For those of you who don't know, the Regis Poem is something that is called an Old Charge of Freemasonry. The Old Charges, in case you haven't ever had them defined, are documents, scrolls, anything like that from between the 14th to the 18th century. My reason for choosing to focus on the Regis Poem of all the Old Charges is because it is claimed to be the oldest of them. So let's see what we thought about years ago in Freemasonry. If you would like to follow along with me while I'm doing this particular episode, I have left a link to the document that I'm going over in the description below. The poem opens with the following lines. Here begin the constitutions of the art of geometry according to Euclid. Whoever will both well read and look may find written in old books of great lords and also ladies that had many children together certainly and had no income to keep them with. So immediately we are told that this is apparently the constitutions of the art of geometry according to Euclid. After that, we are introduced to who you may call some of the main characters of this poem, those being the lords and ladies, and you're immediately told what their problem is. How are they going to take care of their children in the long run? This is an interesting problem for them to focus on because it is a completely Masonic issue. Freemasons are heavily encouraged to think about not just what they will do for the future of their family, but the future of all mankind. Let's return to the poem. And had no income to keep them with, neither in town, nor field, nor enclosed wood. A council together they could take them, to ordain for these children's sake how they might best lead their life, without great disease, care, and strife. And most for the multitude that was coming of their great children after great clerks, to teach them then good works. Okay, let's break a little bit of the Old English apart. So, what have the lords and ladies done? They have come together in a council. Before I go on, I do want to point out that I've noticed that they're saying lords and ladies here, and we're talking about a founding Masonic document. And when I say founding, I don't mean it helped build a Grand Lodge, but if we're claiming this is one of the oldest documents we can find, it is at least foundational in that sense. Now, I do want to point out, in case anyone has missed it, that the document is saying that this council is made up of lords and ladies. I am not claiming that these men or that these women were Freemasons, but it is interesting that men and women are being included in this very old Masonic document, as that isn't, let's politely say, consistently the case. Regardless, what is the point of the council that these lords and ladies are having? The point of the council is to come up with a way for their children to live meaningful lives and have work to support them in those lives. Now, in the next section of the poem that I read to you that mentions the clerks, it's a little bit confusing, but what's happened here is that the council has assigned a number of clerks to a task, and let's get to that. Because this is one of the more fascinating parts of the poem. It's going to make a claim about how Masonry was created. So the poem continues, and pray we them for our Lord's sake to our children some work to make, that they might get their living thereby, both well and honestly full securely. Now here it comes. In that time, through good geometry, this honest craft of good masonry was ordained and made in this manner, counterfeited of these clerks together. At these lords' prayers, they counterfeited geometry, and gave it the name of masonry for the most honest craft of all. These lords' children thereto did fall, to learn of him the craft of geometry, the which he made full curiously. All right, there's a lot to take in there. In short, the claim is that these clerks, at the behest of these lords and ladies, counterfeited geometry and used it to create masonry. Most of us are probably familiar with the rather negative definitions of counterfeit and counterfeiting, in which you are imitating something in order to deceive other people, but an older definition of it simply means to imitate something. The poem continues. Through fathers' prayers and mothers also, this honest craft he put them to. He learned best and was of honesty, and passed his fellows in curiosity. If in that craft he did him pass, he should have more worship than the less. This great clerk's name was Euclid. His name it spread full wonder wide, yet this great clerk ordained he to him that was higher in this degree, that he should teach the simplest of wit in that honest craft to be perfect, and so each one shall teach the other, and so love together as sister and brother. Furthermore yet, that ordained he, master called, so should he be, so that he were most worshipped, then should he be so called. But masons should never one another call, within the craft amongst them all. Neither subject nor servant, my dear brother, though he be not so perfect as is another. Each shall call others fellows by friendship, because they come of ladies' birth. On this manner, through good wit of geometry, began first the craft of masonry. The clerk Euclid on this wise it found this craft of geometry in Egypt land. Those familiar with Freemasonry, or those who are Freemasons, should have noticed how these two parts of the poem talk about how Euclid sort of creates the traditions of Freemasonry right at the beginning, especially our non-judgmental and supportive way of treating one another like legitimate brothers and friends. Now, in the final part of the second section that I read you, it seems to imply that Euclid either learned or taught geometry in Egypt. And let me read the next part of the poem and we'll see what you think about that. In Egypt he taught it full wide, in divers lands on every side. Many years afterwards, I understand, ere that the craft came into this land, this craft came into England, as you say, in the time of good King Æthelstan's day. He made them both hall and even bower and high temples of great honor, to disport him in both day and night, and to worship his God with all his might. This good Lord loved this craft full well, and proposed to strengthen it every part, for divers faults that in the craft he found, he sent about into the land. All right, let's unpackage all of that. It would appear that it's claiming Euclid taught, not learned, geometry in Egypt, and that eventually the craft of masonry comes to England in the day of King Æthelstan. So let's get some time periods here. King Æthelstan was king between the years 927 and 939. That's specifically when he was not just king of the Anglo-Saxons, that's when he became king of all of the English. If you would like, the date for his earliest kingship as king of the Anglo-Saxons was 3 years earlier in the year 924. This king never married or had any children, which is rather unique for a king of this time period. He is considered by history to be a remarkable and great king. There were a number of old buildings associated with him that he supposedly had created, and he's associated with St. Cuthbert due to a number of legends that connect the two characters. He's a uniquely important and truly English king, whom, according to the Regis Poem, is the king who was ruling during the time Freemasonry came to England. This, I think, is interesting because the Grand Lodge of England is not going to be founded until the year 1717, which leaves us with about 750 years of space during which Masonry can be growing within England before there is ever a Grand Lodge, if we are going to take the poem and its claims at face value. Now, I'm going to skip over the 15 rules and points. Those are two separate parts of this document. If you would like to read them yourself, as I said in the beginning, the entire document is linked in the description. I, however, want to now jump around to some sections that I think you're going to find particularly interesting. This section that I'm going to jump to is about Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel. You may hear, as I do read, that many years after, for great dread, that Noah's flood was all run, the Tower of Babylon was begun, as plain work of lime and stone, as any man should look upon, so long and broad it was begun, 7 miles the height shadoweth the sun. King Nebuchadnezzar let it make to great strength for men's sake, though such a flood again should come, over the work it should not take, for they had so high pride with strong boast. All that work was therefore lost, and angels smote them so with diverse speech, that never one knew what the other should tell. Now, I think this is interesting because usually the Tower of Babel story doesn't include a section in which it claims that the reason the tower is built is so that there'll be a section on the earth that people will be able to basically be safe in the case that God would flood the world again. Moving on. Many years after, the good Euclid taught the craft of geometry full wonder wide, so he did that other time also of diverse crafts many more. Through high grace of Christ in heaven, he commenced in the sciences 7. So here it claims that Euclid, even though Euclid and Jesus are very far removed historically, are connected because through the grace of Christ, Euclid commences in the following 7 Masonic sciences. So this section is specifically about those sciences. Grammar is the first science I know, dialect the second, so I have bliss, rhetoric the third, without doubt, music the fourth, as I you say, astronomy the fifth, by my snout, arithmetic the sixth, without a doubt, geometry the seventh, maketh an end, for he is both meek and courteous. Grammar forsooth is the root, whoever will learn on the book, but art passeth in his degree, as the fruit doth the root of the tree. Rhetoric measureth with ornate speech among, and music it is a sweet song. Astronomy numbereth, my dear brother, arithmetic showeth one thing that is another. Geometry, the 7th science it is, that can separate falsehood from truth, I know. These be the sciences 7, who uses them well may have heaven. Now, dear children, by your wit, pride and covetousness that you leave it, and taketh heed to good discretion and to good nature wheresoever you come. Now I pray you take good heed, for this you must know needs, but much more you must know, that you find here written. If thee fail thereto wit, to pray to God to send thee it, for Christ himself he teacheth us that holy church is God's house, that is made for nothing else but for to pray in, as the book tells us. There the people shall gather in to pray and weep for their sin. Look thou come not to church late, for to speak harlotry by the gate. After this, the poem is going to go in a little diatribe about why you're going to want to go to church, and becomes particularly Christian in its focus. So I'm going to let you read that if you want to, and let's talk about everything that came before it. In short, it claims that the sciences build on each other, with geometry in a sense being the greatest of sciences, and that art is greater than many other things, in the same way that one might compare the fruit being greater than the root of the tree. I don't know if that comparison really works out that well, because if you destroy the root, the tree is gone. If you destroy all the fruit, you just have to wait another season. I'm not sure if that's a failure on the metaphor's part or my failure for overthinking the metaphor. Again, though, it is attaching these sciences not to Freemasonry as a later invention, but to Euclid as the founder of what, according to this poem, seems to be the majority of Masonic teaching. It has yet to really speak about whether he ritually initiated people in any particular way. Now, some of you might have a really rather fair question here, which is, wait, I thought Freemasonry was all about men of all religion joining so long as they believe in a higher power, so why is this very old, again, clearly Masonic document, at least according to all people who've looked at it, and even myself, why is this Masonic document making the following claim? That claim being that the people reading the document would all definitely be Christians, and that Masonry is assuming church attendance. If it's assuming church attendance, if you want to read the whole document, you can see it wants you to do the whole 9 yards. It's expecting active participation in the Mass. It's expecting you to be an actively good Catholic. So what happened? Why is Freemasonry now open to people of all faiths if this document makes it seem incredibly clear that you had to be a Catholic? And how did we end up also at the point where Catholics aren't allowed to be Freemasons, at least according to their church? Those questions have 2 different answers. I'm going to answer the first question today, and the second one I'm going to answer in an upcoming video that's going to be about the revolutions of Mexico and the Philippines that were heavily orchestrated by men who happen to be Freemasons as well. Assuming that the poem is completely correct and that I have nothing to question within it, let us assume that Freemasonry was originally not just Christian, but Catholic in terms of the people it was allowing to join, again, if we are assuming the world that this poem presents us. Well, if Masonry actually came to England in the days of King Æthelstan, then it got there quite a number of years before the Protestant Reformation. That means that if you're going to be the king or a duke or any part of mainstream European society back then, you are most definitely going to be an active and participating Catholic. That is just the religious history of Europe right now. There is no other religious option in this part of Europe at the time that is enjoyed by a vast majority of people. Yes, I know there are many pagans, people who are into witchcraft and Wicca, who will really want to argue that no, we were secretly around the whole time, and I'm quite sorry, Wicca and witchcraft were reintroduced to the world by a man named Gerald Gardner, who happened to be a student of Aleister Crowley. You can hate me for that fact, but it'll exist whether you accept it or not. Moving on. So given that everybody is basically being born Catholic at this time and is accepting it as the religion of the land, especially in England at this time, I think that just helps to explain why the Regis Poem, or the Halliwell document as it's also called, seems to assume that it's okay to include as a rule for Masonry that one be an active Catholic. The reason I believe that this changed over time is simply due to the fact that the religious landscape of Europe changed. I would say it's a credit to Freemasons of the time that as the religious landscape of Europe changed and people went to war with each other, it would appear that the vast majority of Freemasons came up with the more enlightened idea to simply expand their idea of religious tolerance and to allow all good men who believed in a higher power into the fraternity. Some other scholars will argue that Freemasonry has always had this non-denominational approach, and aside from this document, that's a pretty easy argument to make. This is the only one that makes it really seem that we're not only aggressively Christian at one time, but Catholic as well. That's not a criticism of the document, it's just what the document happens to say. So unless I want to read the points or the rules, which I really don't because this isn't a section on Masonic ethics, if you would like me to do that, go ahead and leave me a comment or send me a message. I really just want to talk about the poem and its other implications, specifically focusing on the fact that it mentions lords and ladies, and it mentions that the people who are going to be working together in Masonry are supposed to love one another as brothers and sisters. Let me quickly say that that could just be a turn of phrase and that they did not mean for women to be actively involved, but let me at least explore the other idea because it's an extremely odd turn of phrase to use for a group of men that are only men. If there isn't a woman in the group, there's no reason to say that you're going to love each other as brothers and sisters. You would just say that you're going to love each other as brothers. For those of you who are saying, oh, it could simply be poetic license, after all, this is called a poem, it's just a really odd move. I personally do not think that any decent or even poor writer would think, hey, I'm talking about a group of men. You know what I should say when it comes to how they should love and respect each other? I should compare it to how brothers and sisters do it. To me, it doesn't flow in the way that they did it. So does that mean that Masonry once initiated women into it? I actually don't think so. Not because I'm hoping that women will never be a part of mainstream Masonry, it's mostly due to the fact that aside from this poem, there is no mention of a woman becoming a Mason until many, many years later. Now, since I don't want to be accused of not trying to find information on female Freemasons, let me say this. There are documents of historical operative stone guilds having female members as early as the 13th century. So there were female Masons. Now, was there ever a female Freemason? I'm going to give you some information. It's incredibly hotly debated. Do with it what you will. Here I go. According to some sources, there was a woman, specifically an Irish woman. Her name was Elizabeth Adelworth. She accidentally or on purpose viewed the proceedings of a lodge that met at her father's private house. Her father being a viscount. I'm forgetting off the top of my head where, but it was in Cork, County Ireland. When they discovered her, the lodge decided to admit her as a way of forcing her to keep the secret she had seen. If you would like me to do an episode on Elizabeth Adelworth and women who have been in similar positions to her and might have become Freemasons at some point, I'd be more than willing to. I want to end this part of the discussion by saying Freemasonry has always seemed to document what it does, so it would be very peculiar that a woman had been initiated beforehand and not a single lodge ever decided to make a note of it in any meaningful way. You might say, well, where are you pulling that opinion from? And my opinion specifically comes from the fact that there are roll sheets for operative stonemason guilds that have women's names on them and lists them as stonemasons. So I'm willing to believe that it is possible that they could have been members of speculative Freemasonry, but I find it odd that the operative stonemasons kept track of them as members, but not a single speculative one did. That is not proof of anything necessarily one way or another, but it's what makes me come to the conclusion I come to. Aside from the portion of the poem that seems to imply that women should be a part of Freemasonry, or that might have at least been an idea thrown around at one point, the greatest sort of groundbreaking revelation that the poem seems to introduce is the idea that Masonry, A, came to England at a very specific time during the rule of King Æthelstan. Second, that it is apparently a counterfeiting of geometry and was created by Euclid, who taught it in Egypt, and then by some process it gets here. The reason that that's significant is, again, let's look at some dates. It is believed by historians that about 300 years before Christ was born, Euclid was alive doing what he was doing. If that's true, that would mean that Masonry is older than Christianity and would mean potentially one of two things for the author of the poem. It could simply mean that the author was a very poor historian and didn't take into account the fact that if you're going to pin this on Euclid, you can't include Christ. Or it could be that they readily already accepted that Masonry could belong to many different cultures, that men of many different religions and creeds could be part of it, and they just didn't bother to point it out in a overt sort of way. There is no proof for that second part. However, it is not uncommon for older documents to leave out information that they just assumed the reader would know at the time. So where does that leave us at the end of today's episode? Let's, for the sake of it, just assume that the Regis Poem is 100% correct. That means Masonry was established even before the flood of Noah and is an ancient fraternity, probably the most ancient fraternity that could ever exist on the planet, and it has somehow survived every culture that it has come into contact with. That would truly be amazing. I would not hate if it was true. I'm very sorry to anybody who's listening. I don't have a single bit of real proof that that's what happened. It is instead more likely that the story is simply just that. It is a story meant to tell a particular series of points in a dramatized way through the use of the artistic license of poetry. There is probably a fair bit of truth in it here or there. For example, Euclid certainly helped create geometry. Now it's up for everyone's debate if they want to say that geometry ends up becoming, in one way or another, Freemasonry. I would heavily encourage you to read the poem in its entirety and come to your own conclusion on what it actually means for the history of our fraternity. What do you think? Do you think that it's all just made up and a complete lie or legend? Or do you think that there's some real truth to this and that Masonry has been able to hold on to bits of history that the rest of the world has completely lost? Let me know in the comments below or by sending me a message. I would really like to know what you think, and perhaps I'll include it in an upcoming episode. Speaking of upcoming episodes, don't forget to send me any ideas that you have for them, and as I always ask, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Past, Present, and Occult with Emiliano Noriega Petty. Have a good day.